Thank you all for coming. So what we're going to do, you're going to learn a lot today. I mean, you thought this morning was a lot. You're going to get a lot in the next hour or two. Let me give you just a little bit of history about the project, and then I'll introduce you to Kathy and Greg, and they're going to be speaking to you a little bit later. We discovered, I guess is the word, 3 or 4 years ago, in the beginning of the pandemic, companies calling us and asking us for help with recruiting, reskilling, retention, over and over and over again. And I heard the same thing over and over. And what every company was saying to us was, I'm not just recruiting more people because I want to grow the company as is, but we're getting into some new area or some new domain or some new product or some new discipline or some new country, and it's different than it was before, so we need more people. And they're different people, different roles, different skills, different locations. And I thought to myself, this is going on in every industry. And so we decided to do a project, and Kathy has been leading it, to study the changing nature of roles, jobs, and skills, industry by industry. And then we needed data. And so we looked around, and one of the companies we were the most excited about is this company called Eightfold. Hello back there. Hitcham, who's helped us with this. And we looked, and Eightfold has a massive database of employee profiles and studies the relationship between all the data inside of these employee profiles, including skills, and it has a time series to it, so you can go back in time and look at what did these people look like 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 4 years ago, and so forth. And we went to Eightfold and said, let's do this. And they said, great, we're willing to do it with you guys. We'll help you. And we decided to do it by industry. The first industry did was healthcare. And Greg Till is the CHRO of Providence Healthcare, and he's going to talk to you in a few minutes. And we discovered some unbelievable things. So there's 2 things I want to do today. First is we're going to tell you what we discovered and what we learned, which is both interesting and very useful to you as an HR person. And the second is I want to inspire you to do this yourselves. Because what we did is something you can do. And we're not that big a company. We're a 30-person company. You mostly work for pretty big companies that are much bigger than us. So that's the point of this. So I'm going to do the beginning. I'm going to talk about what is going on. I'm going to turn it over to Kathy, who is head of research. I'll let Kathy introduce herself in a minute. And then you'll meet Greg, who's the chief people officer for Providence and one of the most creative, forward-thinking CHROs I've met in any industry dealing with one of the most difficult industries of all. So I showed you this a little bit earlier. I won't go through it again. I've talked about this morning. The thing that's been changing in the world of work is, not just the economy, not just the labor market, not just the growth of different organizations, but the way careers work. And I think if I was an economist and I was featured in the New York Times, I would write an article about why everything we've learned about economics is probably wrong. Because most of the economic assumptions about why things happen around the world of work assume that people work in one job or one career for a long period of time. But the stickiness of your job and your career went away. 40% of the people that changed jobs during the pandemic changed industries. And that's because they're able to move from role to role, job to job, and we've become much more inclusive of that process. And so what this has done is it's changed the role of industries, and it's allowed industries themselves to adapt. Now, the healthcare industry is still the healthcare industry, and it's a very complex, important industry. It is the largest employer in the United States. Almost 16% of Americans work in healthcare. I never realized that until we got into this. It's massive. And by the way, healthcare companies have every business function you do, plus they have to take care of people and keep them from dying and repair them and take care of all the equipment and services and technologies and science and drugs and medications. So they're very, very complicated organizations. And the history of this, of course, is that, if you remember, a decade ago, we thought that what was going on in business was digital transformation. And digital transformation originally meant digitizing the thing we're doing today so that we could deliver it in a digital way. And then we realized, well, now that we've delivered it in a digital way, we have to operate differently because we have to be digital and not just do digital. And then what happened next is we had the pandemic, and now industries are changing. So for example, the healthcare industry, if you've noticed, Amazon.com is getting into healthcare, CVS is getting into healthcare, Walmart's getting into healthcare, TELUS is getting into healthcare. I think most of the big, I wouldn't be surprised if Starbucks decides to do it at one of these days. There's nothing they won't do. But that's an example of how industries are changing. And so what this research shows you is not only kind of interesting economic, kind of data about how industries are changing, but how that affects your job models, your architecture, and how you hire, retain, and retain people. And so these are some of the examples of what's going on in each of these industries. Now, you all work for different companies, and we can talk to you individually, but we talked to Chevron about getting into alternative energy and hydrogen. We've talked to chemical companies that are getting into new chemical industries. We've talked to, obviously the automobile companies. And I'm not saying, I don't really know where this is going to end up, but we're probably going to end up with different industries. And every company is going to be a little bit different in its makeup than it was before. One of the things we discovered as we were going through this is we go to Eightfold and we say, okay, pull us all the data. Here's 200 healthcare providers. Pull us all the data on these companies. All of the job titles, all of the skills, all of the roles, all of the clusters. And we look at it and we realize that even within an industry, there's radical difference in the way companies are organized, which makes sense, right? I mean, you don't know what you don't know. And so, the reason talent intelligence is so powerful is it shows you those things about your company that you can compare with others. In fact, Eightfold has a demo, I'm pretty sure down on this trade show, right? Where you can actually put in your company and it'll show you how your company or your industry compares to other companies in your industry. So this is a really, sort of stupendous thing that you can do. What we did in the GWI work, and by the way, we're just beginning. The next industry is banking. So Stella down here in the front row, who by the way flew all the way here from Greece, is leading our research on banking. So if you're in financial services or banking, you can talk to Stella and talk to you about what we learned there. What this does is it gives you insights into what's going on in your company that cross the traditional boundaries of data and HR. Because as you know, human beings are not just, credentialed and they're not just skilled. They have experience, they have history, they have preferences, and that information can be brought together in this kind of a project. So anyway, that's what we did. Let me now turn it over to Kathy. You're next, and she's going to tell you about what we specifically did in healthcare, and then you're going to learn more about this from Greg. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we did in the GWI, in the Global Workforce Intelligence Project, and then I'll start with the data and the insights we got on the healthcare industry, and then I want to spend most of our time actually talking with Greg, because what they are doing is, I think, leading the industry really in Providence. So Global Workforce Intelligence Project, Josh already talked a little bit about that. What we're doing here, industry by industry, we're getting deep into every industry. We started with healthcare. We're going to financial services next. We're going to do consumer products and pharma and technology in the next year or so. And we're really diving deep based on the Eightfold database and then based on a lot of interviews with leaders in the space on the skills, the roles, the role clusters, and the organizational solutions on the biggest talent problems in these industries. So that's what we're doing here. The way that we're doing this is in a number of ways. So we're getting the global talent intelligence platform from Eightfold. We're also talking with C-suite people, basically C-level people. Greg is one of them that joined us in our journey on the healthcare space as the CHRO, Chief People Officer of Providence. So we're also getting the real-life stories in that. That's really, really important, too, because the data itself could tell us many stories. but the stories are only so powerful if it's actually working in the industry. So real-life expertise is really important too. We bring our expertise from the Josh Bersin company on all of these areas of recruiting and employee experience, learning and development, organization and work design. All of those areas, we know how to do them, and we can bring that to the table. And then we also talk with consulting leaders in the space that focus on these industries, because they see a lot of different companies and experience what the biggest talent problems there are. So that's how we're doing this. And here's some of the metrics and the benchmarks that we're unleashing, and we're going to talk now deeper about job roles, job clusters, skills dynamics, what skills are rising, what skills are declining, what skills are adjacent to each other, so what skills are related to each other, and what skills then can be transferred into other roles, other jobs, and career pathways. Josh mentioned career pathways in his keynote as well. Career pathways are actually something that's very, very powerful, and Greg is going to tell us all about how they are using career pathways actually from other companies in other industries to develop people into these hard-to-fill and hard-to-find jobs. And then industry solutions, because all of this is not very powerful if it's just a theoretical exercise. So all of this is not academic, it's real. It's real based on solutions that companies like Providence and others have done. So that's what we're going to talk about. So healthcare. Let's talk about the healthcare space and why healthcare. Healthcare is the biggest industry, as Josh mentioned, in the US. Over 20 million people, 1 in 7 people in the US are working in healthcare. So if you meet 10 people, chances are one of them, at least one of them, works in healthcare. Very, very big industry. Over 6,000 hospitals in the US. 86% of the workers work in the clinical roles. So the clinical roles, of course, are key, because if you've ever been to a hospital, and I think we've all been, nothing gets done without nurses, without physicians, without technicians. Like, clinical people are really where the heart and the lifeblood of healthcare is. And I worked myself in the healthcare industry actually for almost 8 years at Kaiser Permanente, a very large healthcare organization. And I got to tell you, the people in healthcare are the most passionate, most mission-driven, and most caring people that I've ever met. So I think everybody, regardless if they're in clinical roles or if they're in roles supporting the clinical roles, these people in healthcare that you meet there, I've never met anybody like that. So I think everybody comes to healthcare with the notion and with the desire to help others, and you really feel it with everybody, even with the people that are in office settings, even with the people in IT or in finance or in HR. Healthcare is really an amazing industry, and I think it's very, very complex, because if you think about your own work, they have all the same issues that you have in other industries, only, as Josh said too, you're dealing with literally life and death situations. Like, you are literally thinking about how can we save lives, and that's very powerful, but also very humbling, I think, because you really think about the patients, and the patients could be your mother or your child or your spouse or your friend, basically. So it's very, very important industry, very dynamic too. If you think about, for example, reskilling, healthcare industry has to reskill people all the time because new care protocols come up all the time, new medication, new technologies, new solutions for your patients. So it's not that the skills only change every few years. The skills and capabilities change literally probably every day, right? Because something new comes up every day, and the way and the ability and how quickly you can reskill people actually could save lives as well. So very humbling. Industry is moving very fast. Technology, of course, is real. Patient expectations are changing too, because we all want to get care faster, better, cheaper. And of course, telehealth was a big thing in the pandemic, when from one day to the next, a lot of the visits actually changed to video visits, and I think increased 100-fold or something like that. Personalized medicine is real. So personalized medicine means basically you get what they also call precision medicine. You get the medication that's right for you based on your DNA, based on your makeup. Stella shared an inspiring story how personalized precision medicine actually is helping her specifically. And that's something that she learned from this project as well. So really great story. And of course, data and analytics and data security and all of those kind of things are impacting the healthcare industry as well. Josh talked a little bit about the industry reinvention, and the problem in healthcare is healthcare hasn't just moved into industry reinvention. They still need to balance digital transformation, digital disruption, and industry reinvention all at the same time. So they have to think about product managers and data scientists and patient data experience people, but then also partnerships with retail, partnerships with like retail pharmacies, technology partnerships. All of that has to happen at the same time, and that's one of the other reasons why it's so complex. So let's talk a little bit about what we saw in the healthcare space. So the number one problem that we identified, both on the data, but more importantly in our conversations with the CHROs, was the ability or the capacity actually to deliver care. So nursing roles are growing very, very fast. Nurses is also the biggest role cluster in healthcare. They're growing by 13%, and this is all based on data we got from Eightfold, where we looked back in time and then projected forward in time how much bigger the nursing role is going to be, and it's growing very, very fast. Some of the other roles, not surprisingly, maybe decline pretty fast. But if you think about, for example, administration and finance people, not all of them will want to go into nursing, because nursing is not for everybody, right? It's not for everybody. So even if you try to redeploy all the people that, first it's much smaller space, but then also even if you try to redeploy all the people into nursing area, it wouldn't work, because people need to want to be a nurse, a nursing professional. So for the first time in 17 years, actually, that was blowing my mind too when we looked at that, CEOs, for the first time in 17 years, now think about the labor issues and the workforce issues more so than financial pressures. It's always been, when I worked in healthcare a while back, it was always about financial performance and financial pressures because of reimbursement rates and all of that. But the staffing shortage, and specifically the clinical staffing shortage, is now the biggest problem, not just on the minds of the CHROs, but the CEOs as well. So it's a really, really big issue for everybody in healthcare. So we went out to say, how big is the problem? We heard from all the CHROs, the clinical and the nursing shortage is the biggest problem. We wanted to identify how big is the problem going to be. So we wanted to really quantify it, to know how much are we talking about? How big is the gap? And if you look at job open rates, for example, nursing is always one of the most open jobs. At any given time, I think there's between 700,000 to 800,000 nursing positions open. But we wanted to know, how big is it going to get? How big is the gap going to get? And we quantified with the data that we got from Eightfold and based on turnover projections and entrance rates into the profession, that the nursing gap is going to be 2.1 million people by 2025. So that's more than a third of the people that actually will be needed. And more than a third of these seats will be empty. So that's a really, really big problem for healthcare, but then also for society, of course, as well, because society can't function without care. So it's a really, really massive issue. And the reason why these stats are like this is the average age of the nurses, I think 52 or 53, so a lot of them are going to retire in the next few years, and not a lot of people are going into healthcare, and a lot of healthcare people are also leaving the industry. I read a mind-blowing statistic this weekend, that every hour, on average, 2 nurses get physically assaulted by patients. So the healthcare space is really stressful, and I think 91% of nurses are actually have mental health issues because of it, because the job is extremely stressful, it's extremely hard to do, but they stay. Most of them stay because they care. But like that big gap, how are you going to close that? So we wanted to see, okay, so now we know this massive gap, we know how big it is, how are you going to close it? And is it actually closable? And it turns out, and we'll share with you how we're going to close it, and it is closable, but not with traditional solutions. So we identified you really need to think about the problem not just from a recruiting perspective, not just from a retention perspective, keeping people in the healthcare space and in the nursing roles, not just from a reskilling perspective, bringing new people into the profession, from the industry, and also from outside of the industry. And Greg is going to share the story about how they're partnering with Amazon, which is kind of blowing my mind too. But redesigning the jobs themselves as well. We identified, talking with healthcare leaders and then also reading some studies, that a lot of nurses only spend about 30 to 40% of their time in nursing work, basically. And most of their time is spent on other things that are not called, like what healthcare calls top of license. And top of license is a really, really important concept, even if you're not in healthcare, because top of license means you're doing the things that only you are qualified for, and that you are uniquely qualified for. And that makes, of course, the jobs more interesting, more empowering, less stressful, less burning out, and less time spent on stuff that you didn't need to do. So nurses do a lot of their work actually updating charts, or cleaning up a mess when somebody gets sick, or giving out medication, any of the things that somebody lower level maybe, or even machines, robots, could do better, faster, cheaper. So redesigning the work itself, redesigning employment models, all of this factors into that. And you're going to think about them all holistically. You're going to think about them as a system, because if you redesign, for example, it's going to be a lot easier to recruit people too, because people say, oh my God, this is the job that I'm going to recruit, that I'm going to go into, and this is what my life is going to be, my work is going to be. They're going to join you more so. You're going to be able to retain them much more so as well, because people will feel the job is more empowering, is more interesting. I'm using all these capabilities that I have. And you're also going to have the ability to reskill people much better. So they all go together. They shouldn't be just silos, basically. So here's how we quantified how actually this problem, that 2.1 million nursing gap, is actually solvable. And recruiting is the smallest slice. Of course, you got to recruit people in, but the closure of the gap is only about 350,000 people that it can bring in. And we got this all based on projections that we worked with Eightfold on. Retaining people. About 400,000 people could be retained in the profession, in the nursing profession, if you focus on, for example, mitigating stress, making sure that people have childcare support or other areas where they need help. So 400,000 people you can probably retain in the industry as well, and in the roles. Reskilling. Bigger opportunity, 500,000 people you could reskill, build career pathways into these clinical roles, and develop people maybe into lower level nursing roles, and then help them amp their career and develop a career. But the biggest opportunity, 850,000 people, roles actually come from decreasing the demand for nurses altogether. And when Greg and I talked about it, Greg said to me, I think it's even bigger than 800. Like he said to me, I think you said to me, it's probably more than 70%. We were maybe a little bit conservative on that, but we said almost half the opportunity actually comes from decreasing the demand for nurses, because there's no way you can increase the supply to the level that you have to do. So the redesign of work, of employment models, of staffing decisions, all of those areas actually will help you close the gap. But when you think about how you prioritize in these different areas, probably most of the organizations we talked with, they focus on recruiting a lot. So they have 500 recruiters that just churn, bring people in. And meanwhile, they have maybe 10 people sitting in a corner and doing some redesign workshops or something like that. And Providence is one of the companies that actually focuses on the redesign, and they have a whole model around it, and a whole methodology around redesigning work and redesigning deployment of nurses and of these clinical people. So this is based on what we know of healthcare based on our studies. So we have done a big study on each of these topics at the Josh Bersin Company. We've studied thousands of companies on their recruiting processes, and Josh talked a little bit about that in his keynote. Talent acquisition, Janet Mertens led that for us. We have a massive study on employee experience that we did last year, where we also have thousands of companies where we collaborated with Microsoft actually on employee experience solutions. We also have a really big study on learning and development that Nihal Nanjan led for us, and she's right there, on reskilling and career pathways and talent marketplaces. And then we also have a big study on organization and work design that we did earlier this year, where we know what actually works for redesign. And so the way that you read this chart is, we always have these maturity models, and level 1 is the least impactful, and level 4 is the most impactful. And what we identified here is healthcare is actually better, a lot better than industry average, all industries in recruiting, because they have to be, right? Recruiting excellence is just at the heart of what they do, because they have to constantly recruit, and they're bringing in new technologies and new automation and workforce planning to forecast retirements and all of those kind of good solutions. And of course, what we also identified in our recruiting study was that a great employee value proposition is really key to recruiting. And of course, mission-driven organizations like healthcare bring in mission-driven people that want to align with the purpose of the organization. So recruiting, they're very good at. Retention, a little bit worse than average. Reskilling, a lot of opportunities. So learning and development, they have a lot of opportunities because they have to focus a lot on compliance training, of course, right? Because it's a very heavily regulated industry. So helping people develop where they want to go, growth in the flow of work, as we said in our learning and development study, kind of hard for healthcare organizations. And then redesign, they're about on par with all the other industries. So we know actually how these industries stack up over each other. And when we talked with the healthcare leaders, they verified that too. So we heard the same stories kind of from Greg and others when we talked with them. What are the advanced healthcare organizations doing differently? Providence and others that are really leading the pack here, they are prioritizing, of course, technology, but what we found very interesting, they're not just prioritizing technology roles, they're also prioritizing transformation roles. So they have people that are innovation managers or workshop facilitators or project analysts or process managers. So they have a lot more of these roles, and because of that, they need a lot less operational roles, a lot of less administrative roles, and also 20% fewer nurses. So they already need fewer nurses, so they'll have a much easier way to actually close that nursing gap. Talent intelligence, I'll just brought some solutions in there, really help you define the role clusters, what roles are growing, and you see like one of the charts with the bars, with the lines. All the nursing roles are growing, have been growing over the last few years. How we are also not just looking back, but looking into the future. And skills, of course, skills trend, skills, what are rising skills, what are the fastest rising skills. Also in the bottom there, you have like this kind of triangle thing, very fascinating insights. What are the differentiating skills? So the differentiating skills are, some of them are in the soft skills or in the power skill areas. So what makes a great nurse, for example, is not just the clinical skills, because that's kind of a given, of course, otherwise you can't be a nurse, but advanced technology skills and power skills or soft skills. And then what are the organizational solutions? I'm not going to go into all of them, but for example, talent intelligence lets you identify where there's going to be more nurses than you need, geographically speaking, and maybe you can recruit in these areas and maybe relocate people, even if you're not obviously operating in these geographies. You see that, for example, California is going to need a lot more nurses, but maybe there's other states basically where you can bring people over as well. And career pathways is another thing that you can do with talent intelligence. So you can identify what roles are adjacent, what skills are adjacent, and then how can you help, for example, an environmental services worker to become a nurse aide, for example, with training and, of course, with certification and other things. So really, really powerful. Without that data, you can't really, you're kind of shooting in the dark, right? You don't really know what's going to work. So without that data, you can't build your talent strategy, and you can't build, close your biggest talent gaps. Now, I just wanted to show you that we, from the Josh Bersin Company, these are all of our studies on all these different areas on recruiting, retention, reskilling, and redesign. So we really know what works. I'm not going to get into all of this. And we also have some great case studies and examples. And you see the Providence Health case study as the first one. But amazing things that healthcare organizations are already doing. I think there's a notion out there that healthcare, HR and healthcare is kind of backward looking and backward working, and that's not the case. We've seen the most innovative practices in the healthcare organizations, and I think every industry can learn from them. So lots and lots of interesting examples and practices from Providence and others in all of these areas. Now, this nursing problem is really, really a big problem, and it can't be solved with HR alone. So I talked before about the CEOs being really at the forefront and really being interested in that problem too. And so they need to work on helping influence regulations, of course, because there's a lot of regulations. Even if you redesign the nurses' jobs, like regulations won't allow you to go down or go up in patient-to-nurse ratios in a lot of cases. And we heard from you, Greg, how this is a big struggle because the job might be already designed so they could care for more patients, but the regulations won't allow you to do that. So CEOs really need to influence these local, the state, and the national regulations as well, because it's a very heavily regulated industry. CHRO is, of course, in the middle of all of this. Work redesign, labor relations. Labor relations is big in healthcare, of course, as well. CIOs, of course, and we'll hear a little bit more from Greg on that too, how technology, of course, is at the forefront of all of this. So without technology, you can't really offload a lot of the work off the nurses' shoulders, and you can't close this like 850,000 job, like decreasing the demand. Technology really key on that. So the CIO is in the middle of that. CFO, of course, as well. And they are very interested in that, too, because of rising labor costs and everything. And COOs, of course, as well. So everybody's going to work together on this. So it's not just an HR issue. It's really a C-suite issue and a global issue of all the C-suite. We just created a healthcare industry collection at the Josh Bersin Company, so we have a lot of different reports in there. You see in the industry study there, it's, I think, a 67-page report where we explain all of those areas. And also explain, I think maybe more importantly, all the solutions that healthcare organizations actually do to address that problem. And how you can operationalize all of this, Josh talked a little bit about that too before. You're going to bring all of these different functions together in HR. So you can't just think about it. You're recruiting COE, you're learning COE, your org design people, your EX people, but they have to work together in this cross-functional talent intelligence center of excellence first. And then you identify what's your biggest talent challenge. And it's really important to focus somewhere because you can't solve all the problems. So in healthcare, it was very clear once we started talking with Greg and others, it was the nursing shortage, the clinical capacity shortage. And your industry might be something else. It might be a skills issue. It might be a skills gap. It might be an inability to attract people with the right skills or capabilities. So identify what you're going to focus on, and then you're going to analyze all these roles and skills and organizational trends and organizational solutions with talent intelligence and other areas. And then identify what are the solutions. And then you're going to, of course, plan for it, implement, and then iterate and keep doing and measuring if it's actually working. And I think the iteration at the change management, when we talked with Greg too, big thing. Big opportunity for change management. And I think especially in healthcare is especially critical there because you can't really, like in a lot of areas, you have no room for error because lives could be at stake, right? So it's a really important thing to try to test out small and then scale fast and then continue to improve. Yeah, Josh already talked about that. What if you could do all of this for your organization? So what if you could identify your biggest talent problem based on data? What if you could quantify it? What if you could quantify how to address the problem with data and then try to actually make it work and measure if it's working and then continue to improve? So that's really what we wanted to talk about. And I think Greg will talk with you now, and I'll sit down again, and we'll love to hear your story.
Sure. I don't have any slides, so I'll just sit here and connect a little bit. First of all, how amazing are these two? I feel like you guys hit the jackpot. I have one small story, but compared to the industry-leading thought leadership that you two have been bringing to the table for decades and a lot longer, it's been a really incredible journey, so thank you. A little bit about me. I work for a company called Providence. You heard that a couple times. Providence is one of the largest systems in the United States, healthcare system. Our name might be different in your location, but we're primarily on the West Coast, but we have about 120,000 caregivers. We call all of our employees caregivers. We have 52 hospitals, over 1,000 ambulatory centers, outplacement centers, surgery centers, and those types of things. We were actually started over 180 years ago by a group of 5 nuns. We're a Catholic not-for-profit system, and that mission-focused, values-based leadership is something that the organization really demonstrates even up till today. I also, like you all, thought that healthcare was the place where HR professionals go to die. And so I worked in defense prior to that. I like to joke around with my friends and say I was just saving lives in a different way in the previous industry. But when I got to healthcare, after about a year in process of trying to learn more about it, what I realized is, number one, it's actually one of the most innovative industries in the United States. And it has to be, because things are changing very quickly. Technology is changing, skills demands are changing, the need for healthcare is changing. So that was the first thing that really drew me in. Secondarily, I think we have I really do believe that we have some of the best leaders. Thanks for being like my lead recruiter and lead recruiter number 2 here, convincing folks that healthcare is a really exciting industry. I think we do have some of the best leaders, not necessarily in terms of business leadership, which certainly they're great business leaders, but they're also mission-driven. They are called to the work that they're doing, which also make them great leaders that we try to develop in our profession. And then the third thing I really love about healthcare is the connection to the actual work. You know, I love my previous companies. We were the biggest missile manufacturer in the United States. We shot up a bunch of satellites. We worked on electro-optical systems and radar. I was never really sure exactly how what I did every day as an HR professional related to what that radar did. It was difficult to make the connection for my team. It's absolutely clear in healthcare, if we fill the vacancy gaps, develop more folks, redesign the work, what that means in terms of the clinical care in our communities. And so the connection to the work is also really inspiring. So if you haven't thought about a career in healthcare, you should, because not only is it employing 1 out of 7 of our workforce members in the United States, it's also been the fastest growing industry for the last 30 years. If you look at US jobs in general and the healthcare jobs, you can see that healthcare is one of the fastest growing industries. It's going to be continue to be a bigger and bigger part of our GDP. And so that's my healthcare sales pitch. It's a really, really exciting industry and challenging, like you mentioned. You know, generally in the US, you probably all know this, but our death rate is increasing, our birth rate is decreasing, immigration has come to a standstill, and so the number of workers in the workforce is at its lowest level of increase ever. And that is not going to get better, it's going to get worse. And so the reason I think it's 70% needs to be focused on redesign specifically, not even just reskilling, redesign, is because the pie is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller until the population dynamics start to change again, maybe never, but at the very soonest 30 years from now. You know, post-baby boomers, post-generation X and Y, until then the workforce is going to get smaller and smaller. In fact, Elon Musk, who is polarizing, so some of you might love him or not, some of you might not, thinks that the biggest problem that the US has right now is the birth rate not being able to replace the US workforce. He actually thinks it's going to lead to a global catastrophe. That 2 million number that you mentioned, 2 million nurses short, that's a third of our nursing population vacancy if we don't solve this problem. Across the globe, that number is 15 million, short 15 million. So we can't just go to the Philippines or to India to get nurses anymore. There are also increasing shortages in other countries as well. And so Providence saw this coming. We've had a massive workforce shortage in the healthcare industry for over 10 years, and it's been getting worse and worse. And the pandemic made it even worse. To add to the challenges that you mentioned on the charts that you explained really clearly, I mean, at times I was about to start crying, at times I was inspired, so great job. Over 20% of our nurses left the profession during the pandemic. They're never coming back. One of the biggest reasons for that, as you saw, that the average age of a nurse is 52 years old. Many of them have really strong 401ks. The market was doing really great until this year, and so they retired. They're not coming back. And frankly, the work is really physically demanding, and so they're not able, in some cases, to come back. And so we've been thinking about this problem for a long time. So we do have some of the typical strategies that I'm sure all of you do. We have 4 primary workforce strategies. Number 1, inspire our workforce. That's kind of where the recruit and retain come in. Unfortunately, healthcare has a massively high attrition rate. First-year attrition in healthcare, on average, is 25%. We lose 25% of the people we hire in the first year of employment. And within the first 3 years, about a third of the nurses leave the entire profession. And so a lot of folks get into healthcare, decide it's not for them, and that's why you see the spike in one of your charts on hiring. It's because we're a hiring machine. At Providence, we're going to fill 45,000 positions this year. We have 120,000 caregivers, and we're going to fill 45,000 positions this year in the worst workforce crisis that we've seen in the US. And so inspiring our caregivers, really aligning our value proposition, connecting people to the work that they do, making sure that we enable them to live their calling every single day is job number one. Job number two is really developing the folks that we currently have. If you look at the top 5 reasons why folks leave any of the jobs, and this is probably true for you as well, but we do a ton of data analytics on why people actually leave, what they say on our employee surveys before they leave, what the other conditions are that before they leave. 1, 2, and 3 are related to development. You know, I don't see a career path. I don't have the development that I need. I haven't had a good conversation with my leader. Are about the top 3 reasons that people leave. They don't see a path for themselves. Other ones are related to burnout and workload. And so development is key to us. And it can't just be developing our own caregivers. That is a retention tactic. It's core to our value proposition. We want to offer all of our caregivers debt-free education. We also think that we can lift people out of poverty because, like you mentioned, we're taking an Amazon warehouse worker and showing them less than a 5-year path to a 6-figure salary in healthcare if they're willing to do the development. And so in addition to debt-free education, we're committing to our caregivers and folks in our communities that we can lift them out of poverty through our development systems. The third one is just to enable them more effectively to do the work that they're doing. As you heard, about 45 to 50% of a clinician's work is not being performed at the top of their license. In addition to, massive waste, it's really costly to have somebody that you're paying $100,000 a year be doing work that somebody that's making $20,000, $30,000 a year could be doing. But it's also massively disengaging. It's like not what they went to school for, to type a bunch of stuff into the EMR, or to be doing discharge paperwork, or to be fighting off family members, or doing other things that others could be doing. And so we have a commitment to our caregivers to enable them. That's our third strategy. And then the fourth one is the stuff that's really exciting to me. All those things are really focused on today's population. That's the pie that we have that we want to optimize. But a big part of the exciting work is in the last strategy, which is really focused on workforce transformation. And I like your 4 R's, but I also like my 4 D's in our workforce transformation. And they actually really kind of align to the strategies that you've outlined. The first one is to deconstruct. Deconstruct every single clinical job so that we make sure that we know what the unit elements are. We have a dream that our entire workforce should be able to work without a college degree, because it's really most important that we skill them up for the job that they need today, and that they're always working on the skills that they need for the jobs they have tomorrow and then the next day. Probably about 2/3 of what they learn in nursing school isn't going to be able to be applied in the first several years of nursing. Why are we forcing folks to go through a 4-year degree program in order to get those things? And same thing with higher education. I'm a big fan of higher education, got lots of higher ed degrees myself, but in terms of our current workforce, a lot of it's a waste of time. How do we skill them up for the jobs they need in the future? And a big part of it is really knowing what those skills are and what the skills are going to be for the future. And so that's what deconstruction means, is really looking at every job and then redesigning them to suck out all the dull, the boring, the dangerous, and to optimize it so that we can provide really engaging jobs at the top of license or top of capability for our clinicians, which will help not only with their engagement and their joy of practice, we say in healthcare, but also, frankly, the cost of providing that care. One of the other scariest stats, especially on the West Coast, is the massive inflation that we've experienced in healthcare in the last 2 years. You all are going through that same thing in your industry. Unfortunately, we can't pass our cost on to our consumers. We have payers that it takes years to renegotiate contracts with. One of our top payers is the government. It's really difficult to squeeze that stone to get more money from a Medicaid payment. And so we really have to look at how we continue to reduce costs and squeeze. We can't pay that, force that cost onto our patients. And so in healthcare, year over year, labor inflation's overall been about 8.5%. 2 years, labor inflation is 16.5%. On the West Coast, where all of our hospitals are, labor inflation, 1 year labor inflation, anyone got a guess? 25% year over year, increased labor cost on the West Coast. 25%. Imagine tomorrow if your business had to deal with a 25% labor inflation of highly skilled workers. That's not, McDonald's raising their rates for minimum wage workers by $2. Those are nursing rates and tech rates and doctors' rates in addition to those lower paid folks. And it also represents how we fill our vacancy gap by hiring agency workers, temporary workers. And so, unfortunately, we can't, I was at BJ's a couple of weeks ago, and they said, I'm sorry, I know you see half of our restaurant empty, but you can't sit down at any of those tables because we don't have enough servers. All right, great. You don't have capacity, you get to close off some of your tables. In healthcare, we can't close off our beds. You're sick, you're having a heart attack, you need our care. And so we just hire more expensive people to do the work. There's about 100,000 agency workers. They make 3 times as much as the nurses. Wow. They give you less quality care. They disrupt the work. They're not as mission aligned. We have to pay them 3 times as much, and so that's another big contributor to the workforce cost. So deconstruction is number 1. Second, which really goes hand in hand with that, is making sure that we move to digital. Everybody is thinking about how they move to digital. For us in the workforce space, it's absolutely critical because we can't, the pie is getting smaller. We can't just hire and retain our way to greatness. That's like I like to say 1980 called and they want their strategy back. It's getting smaller and smaller. So we can keep more, we can try to slow the walls from coming in on us. But we really got to either decrease the need or figure out a way to increase the pie. And so digitizing is one of the ways that we're going to need be able to do the work with less healthcare workers. The third way is more effective deployment. We know, we have 120,000 caregivers. We have lots and lots of units, lots of schedules. How do we deploy people more effectively? A lot of people aren't working to the top of their hours. And then the last one, the last D, is really about diversifying our sources of talent. And that does involve things like turning Amazon warehouse workers into MAs, LPNs, CNAs, so that we can get them on the track to a 6-figure salary. It does mean, you saw the chart that was presented earlier representing that the West Coast had the highest need for nurses from a growth perspective. Well, that's also the most competitive market, and it also has the highest route of nurses. And so we're not going to produce more nurses in California, as many as we need. And so how do we utilize technology to go into the Midwest or in other places to actually not even just bring them to California, but to do some of the care virtually from Arkansas, where they have more nurses than they need, for instance. And so our 4th D is to diversify our talent. So happy to talk about any of those strategies that sound interesting in more depth. But we're doing a lot of innovative work in all of those strategies in order to make sure that we shrink the pie, continue to keep as many as we can, and then also reskill folks, mostly from other industries, as we're trying to accelerate the growth of our own workforce to retain them, but also make sure that they're able to prepared to take care of all of us.
Thank you, Greg. Okay, so there was really 2 points to this presentation. The first is to teach you a little bit about the healthcare industry, which is much, much more interesting than you probably ever imagined. And the second is to give you some examples of what you could do. Let me open it up to questions. Does anybody, I can ask Greg and Kathy some questions, but I'd like to hear from you guys since you've been quiet for 45 minutes. Anybody want to? You can leave it up to me. I got some stuff, yeah.
Well, luckily we're in some really big cities, and so we've developed partnerships with other companies like Amazon and Microsoft in other areas prior to kind of leaning into this space. And so we have really strong relationships with CNOs of a lot of really big companies. And so in addition, primarily for technology. And so one day I sat down with the CHROs in those companies. I said, hey, you're also trying to digitize your workforce and lower your cost. And I know warehouse workers, for instance, at Amazon are being laid off. I said, I wonder if there's a creative partnership that we could work on together where you continue to invest in their development and we build a path from warehouse worker to MA. And so we kind of sketched out this program where Amazon actually pays for their development. They go through our MA training program. We actually are building our own National School of Health, online School of Health Professions, coming to a theater near you sometime soon. And so they're actually being paid as an Amazon warehouse worker while they're becoming an MA. We guarantee them a job. And so they're one of the best pipelines now that we have for MAs. And not only do we show them, hey, this is how you can become an MA, because the pay isn't that different between an Amazon warehouse worker and an MA, but we also say, hey, check this out. Based on the skills that you need to become a CNA, and et cetera, all the way up to potentially a nursing leader, We can show you a path to nursing leadership, which is a 6-figure job in less than 5 years. If you're willing to take invest in yourself, we'll be willing to invest in you. We pay for all their education. If you work at Providence, we prepay for certifications and education for our lowest paid workers, and then we have education reimbursement like everybody else, but we pay at the top of market for education, so that if you're willing to invest in yourself, we'll invest in you along the way. And one of the ways that we accelerated that is by focusing on skills, not certifications or degrees. If they're not required, if a degree isn't required by a government agency, we're not going to require it either.
No, great question. I would imagine that the cost of that education is probably lower than retaining, losing, rehiring, the turnover, right? I mean, this is not like net new. This is actually probably cost savings.
It's ridiculously low cost. I had a lot of passionate arguments with our CFO about 3 or 4 years ago. Basically, my theory is that no education dollar can be badly spent.
Yeah.
And so we've literally in the last 4 years quadrupled our education spend. And it's paid dividends on our retention. We have one of the best retention rates. It's still bad compared to an area like defense, where when I was working there, at least retention was like 98%. Healthcare suffers from high attrition. Yeah. But our attrition, we hire better than anybody in our industry, in our locations. We retain more than anybody in our industry, in our locations, and part of it is because of our investment in our caregivers. So absolutely.
I have another question that I think people might be interested in. This work of deconstructing work. When we studied org design, we found a real lack of knowledge and awareness on how to do this. Did you just make it up?
We started, it actually gained a lot of energy, that phrase that I love is that necessity is the mother of invention. Like, it actually got we've had these plans for 5 years, but our nursing leadership especially was a little bit reticent. One of the great things about healthcare is it's existed from the first man and woman on the earth. And one of the bad things is the same thing. Like, history and success are big barriers to change. We've been around for 180 years doing stuff a lot of the same ways. And so even though we have really innovative nursing leadership, it was hard to get that over the goal line. But through the pandemic, there was such a scarce resource from a talent perspective, we couldn't take care of all of our patients. And so we started asking ourselves, well, what are the elements of all the jobs from a clinical perspective?
So the nursing leaders themselves worked with you to deconstruct the job?
Oh yeah, of course. And so we identified 5 primary jobs. Nurses make up a third of our workforce. Yeah. And so that was an easy no-brainer. And because of it's not, I was going to say pending doom, because of the current doom, that was one of the areas that we started, was nursing, CNAs, MAs, and a couple of other roles. And we said, let's just take a look at those and ask her, take off all the blinders. Imagine if everyone could be a gig worker. Imagine if we eliminated degrees and certifications for every position. Imagine if we, could have a virtual workforce in the Philippines that was able to provide really great care. And so let's just take off all of the preconceived notions about what healthcare has to be. Keep what it should be. Like, it should be a very compassionate, hands-on experience. But then, and we identified 60% of a nurse's role that didn't need a nurse. And to date, we've deconstructed that to identify those things, and we've either digitized, outsourced, pushed work to other bodies about 20%. And so we still have some room to go, but that's about $1.5 billion savings for a company like Providence once we implement all of the deconstruction. And that's just phase 1. And the most important part is capacity. It also gives us more capacity to care for our communities.
So it's not buying a robot and turning it on.
There might be some robots, there might be, but no, exactly. It's work, and it has to be done in partnership.
And that's the point I wanted to make up, is a lot of this digital transformation is really people work.
It is.
Looking at the jobs.
Yeah.
It's org design first. The technology has to support the new design. Yeah. And the design has to be done in partnership with clinicians, CFOs. I loved your chart. This is not an HR wonks idea that gets implemented without anybody else. I mean, we have a cross-functional team that includes finance, IS, clinical leaders, external partners, and others helping us to deliver these solutions.
What else? Anything? Yep.
There's a ton of noise right now in new technology that's trying to help digitize every industry. What have you found most helpful? What's top of mind when you wake up in terms of either new technology to look for or technology that's really been helpful for you guys, whether that's specific to the HR department within healthcare or healthcare? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, our employees are a great source of where to prioritize digitization. They know where we can digitize. And so some of it is just easy stuff that can ease their way. Like we partner with QStream to basically help people test out of compliance training. That saved us $20 in the first year we implemented it because people didn't have to sit through death by PowerPoint for 2 hours. So there's lots of simple things like that that any company can deploy to just take a bunch of stuff that is non-value added, even for the most mundane administrative roles, off their plate. The other really cool stuff that we've been doing, some of it's homegrown or through partnership, is by really frankly treating, I hate to say this out loud because I hate using words like resources to talk about people, or I hate the term human capital. Like, people are people. They're the heart of our organization. They're a primary value contributor. But if you don't think about the work in the same way that you think about your supply chain challenges with digital automation, prediction, then we're probably not adding enough value. And so in addition to the deconstruction, we actually looked at what elements of the work could we predict that would help us to deliver better value as well. And so one example of that is with nurse scheduling. We can predict patient volumes out 3 months out to about 80% accuracy. We can predict the talent that we'll need in that 3 to 6 months with about 90% accuracy. And so we designed and implemented this predictive scheduling tool, which basically takes 3 hours of work off of a nurse manager's plates and pumps out optimized schedules, which also helps you to reduce the need for nursing talent. And so it's a little, and what the other cool thing it does is it also gives nurses the choice about whether they want to be working 4, 8, or 12-hour shifts. One of the ways that you can extend the life of a nurse is by not making them be on their feet for 12 hours a day for 3 days straight and then 2 days of overtime. And so our predictive scheduling tool is another way that we've tried to ease the way and take kind of an administrative burden off the plates of our clinicians, but also to increase capacity.
I love this scheduling tool that you mentioned, because when I worked in healthcare, I know this was the #1 complaint of the nurse manager, that they spent all the, 10 hours a week scheduling people, right? And they said, I didn't become a nurse, so I write schedules all the time. So I think that's another thing, because nurse managers, I think that for us, at least when I was in healthcare, was one of the hardest job to retain and to basically get people into that job because of that scheduling. So it's a really big deal, I think.
Kathy,
scheduling.
Go ahead.
One of the greatest things that Greg brings to Providence is leadership. Leadership in challenging aspirations to advance the overall compassion and people within the organization. That said, 120,000 plus caregivers. Greg, would you comment on how all of the things that you've just talked about, how have you promoted and enabled better change throughout the organization?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I learned when I came to a conference like this 20 years ago was that I was sitting next to a consultant, and they said, Greg, people don't buy into what they don't help to create. And that was like one of the most brilliant things that I've ever learned from a consultant. And so we always involve the critical stakeholders in the chain, in the design of in the problems identification, and some of the solution identification, and all along the way. And so our CNO and I are tied at the hip on every solution that touches nurses. And we also involve, our CFO, CIO, et cetera, like I mentioned. And so, for me, that's the biggest barrier typically to change, is that one of the populations, it's not that they don't want to do it, that might be like 20%. So they don't know why they need to change, they don't know what to change, they don't know what to do differently. And there may be a little bit of resistance, but to the extent you get them involved, people that they trust, I think the change goes a lot better. We also really try to inspire everybody all the way up to our CEO and board on some of the workforce changes that we're making. And that also helps to help them grease the skids. And then lastly is we partner with our innovation group to design scalable solutions that we could eventually sell. We're not ready yet, but this predictive scheduler is coming to a theater near you sometime soon. If you can't afford to build your own, we'll sell it to you. And the same for some of our other tools. We have a predictive hiring tool that I'm really excited about too. And so we also design to scale. So we look at every one of those kind of solutions to solve our own internal business problem, but also could we sell it? And that really, frankly, makes us throw away a lot of the crap that we imagine and only keep the good stuff.
I think we're out of time. Are we done exactly at noon? You guys all have to rush off to the next thing? Okay, so we're going to have a Q&A at 4, correct? at the Eightfold booth. So save your questions.
Yeah.
Greg, thank you so much for
Thank
coming.
you.
Kathy, thank you for all the work.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
That's amazing.